From the peak of contentment being married to the town's beloved woman, having 2 wonderful children, running a successful business, and living in my hometown, a place I always wanted to reside, to plummeting into the depths of despair in a matter of weeks is my story. I live in Culberson, a small town in a Midwest state. The population of our community is only 1,000 people. Our nearest urban area, a city of 20,000, is located about 60 miles away. With other smaller villages in between, we have a couple of convenience stores, a precursor to Walmart, a small store that sold mainly groceries, but also had a toy section, clothing, office supplies, a camera department, and various other items, including patterns and cloth for those who enjoyed sewing. We also have a small pharmacy, a local True Value franchise, a farm store, a couple of cafes, no fast food restaurants, a large locally owned bank, a small credit union, and my computer services business. My company was mostly an IT consulting service. I sold hardware such as computers, servers, and monitors, but mostly to those that were interested in the whole package, including networks. Some of my clients included the bank, the local hospital, and the school system. My closest competitor was in a more urban area, but I also had clients there and often had to troubleshoot my competitors' networks. Oh, I guess I should actually introduce myself. My name is Tim Moran. I am 30 years old. For any who care, I am 6 foot tall and weigh 180 pounds soaking wet. Up until recently, I was married to a girl I knew all through middle and high school. Becky Maines, met her on now, soon to remarry as our divorce is final. We were married for 7 years. I thought they were good years, but I guess she didn't think them so good as she blindsided me with the divorce petition. Now, I must clarify that we were not high school sweethearts. We barely spoke to each other because we were part of different social circles. Although we attended the same university, we didn't associate with the same people there either. In fact, I didn't care for her much in school since she was considered the local favorite. Her father, Ronald Maines, owned the town's only bank. Maines Federal Bank provides loans to local farmers. The feed store, the independently owned convenience stores, Ned's Superstore, and most of the other businesses in the area. Additionally, many residents have car and home loans through that bank. It seems we all prefer to meet with our banker in person, which is why online banking hasn't really taken off here. I even have a modest operating loan with my father-in-law. Well, anyway, back to Becky. It wasn't until after we graduated with our bachelor's degrees that she suddenly showed interest in me. In high school, I had daydreamed a bit about her. She was the attractive blonde with a good figure and the head cheerleader. I was a starting defensive end during football season. A forward in basketball, ran the 1,000-meter and 2,000-meter races in track, and played center field in baseball. Now, Becky was not exactly stuck up. She would refute that little generalization if you threw it at her, but she did project that attitude of entitlement. She dated the quarterback, who also played point guard and pitched baseball. Josh was a good guy and a good athlete. He went to a different university on a full-ride scholarship to play football, and that was when they broke up. Like I said, I didn't run in the same circles as Becky did during our college days. She was a high-ranking member of her sorority, the largest on campus, and her corresponding fraternity was the largest on campus. There were always fraternity or sorority-sponsored events to take up time outside of class. On the other hand, I was a nerd. I spent a lot of time outside of class learning hardware and software, as well as various systems, and the difficulty computerizing them. My choice of study required at least as much time studying as I put in the classroom. I also had to have a job to help pay what the small scholarship didn't. My dad managed Ned's Superstore, so he earned a modest salary enough to keep me ineligible for grants. For perspective, you could quadruple the square footage of my parents' house, and it still wouldn't match the size of Ronald Maine's main residence. During the summer, Dad and I would go camping almost every other weekend. Fishing was an affordable and enjoyable pastime. Becky and her parents would jet off to Aspen, the Ozarks, Miami, occasionally to Hawaii, and then up to Maine, just for fun. Get the idea? We were very different people who just happened to grow up in the same small town. When I came home from school, suddenly Becky wanted to date me. She was almost stalking me. I really never understood her interest. Yes, I had started my business, but at the time I was a one-man operation. I had applied for a small business grant for my startup money, and I was showing a small profit after the first year. Becky finally bit the bullet and asked me to dance one night when we both seemed to be at the same bar with a live band. We fit together pretty well. Mom had insisted that I learn to dance various different steps, so I didn't equip myself too badly. We parted as the bar shut down for the night with a kiss by her car and a promise by me to call the next day for a real date. I was an only child. Something about Mom's uterus that didn't allow normal development of the fetus. I guess I was a miracle baby. Becky had a brother who left home at age 18 and fell off the face of the earth. I guess he didn't like Ronald much during the year after I graduated. My dad died of a sudden heart attack. Mom said he was talking about mowing the yard, and sometime later she noticed something sticking out of the small shed door at the back of the lot. My dad had collapsed there, and by the time Mom noticed, it was far too late. The ambulance guys didn't even try to revive him. He had been gone too long. Becky attended Dad's funeral. Even though we had only been on a few dates, it pleased me to see her there, and she migrated to my side of the cemetery and held my hand as the tears coursed down my face. She was also very gracious to Mom and some of the small contingent of family that had traveled quite a ways to support us. Mom's house was fully paid off before Dad passed, and he had a pretty good life insurance policy that assured her a living income the rest of her life if she was careful. Thank God for that as the recent events unfolded. I'll get to that in a bit. The old joke is about the man who pursued a woman until she caught him. However, that wasn't how it went with Becky and me. She pursued me. She invited me out. She was the first to express interest in taking our relationship to a more intimate level. I'll refrain from details, but we were compatible in that regard. We began to date exclusively, as far as I knew, and I hadn't heard any talk of her seeing anyone else. We were intimate 2 or 3 times a week. There were days I had to travel to some of the outlying communities. Some of the larger farms wanted to integrate all their computers from the tractors to the planters, the milking parlors, and then the household computers all had to have Wi-Fi access with the building, sometimes quite a ways apart. There were logistical obstacles to overcome. So I don't know if Becky sat at home in her parents' house on nights I had to be too busy to see her. Oh yes, I forgot to mention Becky's job, since her major was women's studies. She couldn't find a suitable job in Culberson, so she started working for her father. She began as a teller and quickly advanced to vice president of the loan department. Although it was due to nepotism, she dedicated herself to the work and became educated in banking as her father desired. Years later, I can look back and see how I was played into marriage. One night, just before Christmas that year, Becky informed me that she was pregnant and asked what I was going to do about it with the values that were instilled by my parents. I immediately asked her to marry me. I should have immediately realized my love's actual pregnancy status when she and her mother chose a date 7 months after the announcement of our engagement that Christmas time. By the time I finally figured out that she had lied about being pregnant, the plans were set and the massive amount of invitations had been sent out. I confronted Becky and she just shrugged his shoulders. Her explanation, if I left it up to you, we would never get married, let alone engage. I love you and you love me. This will work. I was smitten with the town's beloved Becky. Our intimate moments were incredible, and I longed to share a bed with her. Despite discovering she had been dishonest about her pregnancy, I chose not to make a fuss. The wedding was the largest hosted in our town in anyone's memory. Everyone was invited. We even held it on a Sunday afternoon so all the businesses could close down. The feast was extraordinary, catered by a firm from our urban community. We honeymooned in Barbados, where Becky discovered a clothing-optional beach and chose to go without clothes almost every day we were there. Our intimate moments ranged from tender to vigorous. We experienced everything. We explored the island on a motor scooter and snorkeled in the clear Caribbean Sea. After our 2 weeks of indulgence, it was time to return to work. Initially, I had 1 employee, but before our marriage deteriorated, I had expanded to 3 technicians and a secretary bookkeeper to keep us all organized and on track. About a year after we married, Becky announced that she was pregnant. This time, it was not a false alarm. Constance, my little Connie, was born with all 10 toes and fingers and was destined to be spoiled rotten. She is my little girl, though. 2 years later, we welcomed Thaddeus, or Todd for short. He also came fully formed. My life was complete, and I was as happy as a pig in mud. Our 7th year was when things seemed to change. Becky suddenly was needed to work a lot of evenings and some weekends. I could understand the occasional banking conference, but it was a slow year, and there couldn't have been any new influx of loan applications that would merit all these evening meetings and weekend hours. Becky always answered her cell phone when I called, but I tried not to bother her unless it was important. There were never any missed calls or times when she answered out of breath, but I was still a little concerned. Our intimate life also suffered since Becky was seldom home before I went to bed. Many nights I had to go to sleep right after the kids because of my commute to meet my customers. Yes, I had more help, but that was only to keep me from being overwhelmed. We were all very busy, but I organized my day so I could be home in the evenings, especially if Becky was unavailable to look after the kids. I remember the last time I made love to my wife. I came home on a Friday night, and lo and behold, she had actually arrived before me and had supper ready for us. The kids were beside themselves talking to their mother throughout the meal, so much so we had to actually ask them to eat. We all then cleaned up the table and got the pots, pans, and dishes into the dishwasher before sitting together and watching Shrek for the umpteenth time. The children were thrilled to see Becky, and she had to tuck them in for the night. I was not permitted near their bedroom that evening. Once they were settled, Becky returned to the living room with 2 glasses of wine, wearing high heels and a delicate garment known as a baby doll that highlighted her attractiveness and stirred my desire. We settled on the couch and sipped our wine while Becky whispered her desires for the evening. She didn't seek tenderness. Instead, she craved an intense experience. I doubted my ability to meet her expectations as it had been a long time since our last encounter, and I feared I might climax prematurely. I gave it my all and collapsed into a dreamless sleep. When I woke on that Saturday morning, Becky was already dressed and held an envelope in her hands. Time to wake up, dummy. Where was the loving woman of last night? Why the term dummy? The kids are all dressed and ready to go to mom and dad's. That is where I will be staying this weekend. That will give you about 48 hours to remove your belongings from my house. Monday morning, there will be a protection order entered against you, citing mental cruelty and a tendency to violence when you are upset. The divorce papers in the envelope will also be filed at the same time. I was flabbergasted. I finally found my voice and asked, "What is going on and why are you doing this?" Simply put, Josh has joined the bank to work alongside my father, and we plan to marry as soon as my divorce is finalized. We've been reconnecting for months, and now is the moment to take action. As she was leaving, she paused to toss the last grenade on my life. By the way, Josh can't have kids, so he wants to adopt Constance and Thaddeus. They will now always be referred to by their given names, not the hillbilly nicknames you came up with. She slammed the door on her way out. I spent the first 12 hours of that weekend just reading and rereading the contents of the envelope. Rebecca, not Becky anymore. Not only wanted the house, but my business. Also, the term said I could still run the business, but I would only make minimum wage, less than even the rest of the crew. She wanted full custody. The requested child support would be more a month than I would actually make under her demands. She also wanted alimony, even though she would be making many times what I could make. She had her car titled in her name, but mine was owned by the company. As long as I was employed by the business, I could still drive it, We had some savings, not a lot since we were still young, but some. She had already pulled all but a few dollars out of the account. I didn't even get half. Finally decided to stop reading and fretting and take action. I called around and found someone to lend me a pickup and a trailer. I had no friends of my own, just our friends, and knew they would not be helpful. Eventually, I called a couple of guys I used to hang out with in high school, and they immediately came over, and we packed the trailer with things that Becky would not argue over. I had nowhere else to go, so I went to work. I had bought the entire building a year before so we could have more room for expansion. The second floor had a small apartment in the back that was dingy and dirty. I rolled up my sleeves and cleaned all day Sunday. An air mattress was my bed. My friends lent me some old furniture and some pots and pans so I could eat and sit on something. A small microwave would have to suffice as my cooking appliance for a bit until I could find a stove. I also needed a refrigerator, but made do with a cooler full of ice for my drinks. On Monday, I woke stiff and sore. I do not recommend an air bed except as an emergency bed. The shower was cold as there was no hot water on the second floor, only a small tank for the bathroom in the office downstairs. I managed to shave and look somewhat presentable. I called some of the local attorneys and was soon made to be aware that I was being perceived on the same level as a mass murderer. My father-in-law had put out the word there would be no help provided to me or loans would be called in. I had no time to get a lawyer from farther away, so I represented myself in court that morning. Judge Gavin presided. I had a really bad feeling. The judge always attended events hosted by the Maines family, and I would bet his car and home loans were through Maine's Federal Bank. He directed his first comments to me. "Mr. Maron, why aren't you represented by counsel, Judge? I beg your pardon. But I was served my papers on Saturday morning by my wife, and so could only look for an attorney this morning before court. No local attorney will take my case. I ask for a continuance to seek counsel from farther away." Denied. I don't understand this. According to the file, these papers were filed 3 weeks ago, and this court date was scheduled then. The file also shows you were served at your place of business that same day by a deputy. You had plenty of time to seek representation and file the required papers showing your financial status. I should hold you in contempt at your blatant attempt to delay these proceedings. Your Honor, I wish to protest and hope this is recorded in the official court record. I believe I am being forced into a settlement that favors my wife entirely, aiming to ruin me rather than benefit my children. Given that all my earnings records are filed jointly, my wife should have been able to present my financial standing, thereby negating the request for excessive child support. Furthermore, she has announced her intention to remarry as soon as our divorce is finalized, so alimony should not be an issue. He slammed his gavel down. Silence. You, sir, are out of order. You have had plenty of time to respond to the summons. I find for the plaintiff. He slammed his gavel down again and stood and left the chamber. I was aghast. In a matter of minutes, I was divorced. I may find it very difficult to see my children ever again. And my business had been taken away. I glanced at my ex-wife. Rebecca appeared slightly remorseful for her actions. She mustered a defiant gaze. "You better get to work. I don't pay you to sit around looking like someone just spoiled your breakfast." Hate was becoming a more dominant emotion over the confusion of the past few days. I had to control myself as I could see the bailiff watching me very closely. He didn't seem too friendly. Joshua and his companion got up and followed their attorney out the door. I sat and waited. I needed to give them no reason to have me thrown in jail. I was starting to believe that was one of their objectives. If I were in jail for losing my temper, then her accusations would seem more believable. The bailiff came over and spoke to me quietly. "They should be out of the building by now. The other bailiffs are watching. But you know how influential the Maines are in this town. Indeed, in this entire county. Get yourself a lawyer from the state capital. That should be far enough away. We support you and sympathize with you, but can't risk being discovered." I nodded and thanked him. When I went out, there were multiple people in uniform lined up to watch me leave. I went to the office. Surprisingly, Rebecca and Joshua weren't there ahead of me. I figured they would beat FT to tell the staff who was now the new owners. Their arrogance cost them a little. First, I made sure that all the staff members were busy with assignments. I then wrote out a check for cash and sent our secretary bookkeeper to the bank to cash it. I directed her to tell anyone who might question it that I was going to be out of town for a few days servicing distant clients and would need cash. I assumed that if I went to the bank myself, there would be efforts to hinder me unless the judge had signed a court order specifying the new owner of the business. The bank shouldn't withhold funds from the business. This was not unusual, as many small towns preferred cash over debit or credit cards because banks and credit companies charge a percentage of every transaction, which affects the businesses directly. Since my name was still on the bank's signature card, I could withdraw as much money as I needed. I assumed my credit and debit cards were now non-functional, so I needed some cash, the kind with a deceased president on each bill. There was more than enough money in the account to pay next week's payroll, but I didn't want my staff to struggle. I only withdrew a couple of thousand. I also took some money from the petty cash drawer and left an IOU for my ex-wife and her new partner. I now had to act like the defeated man that I was. The thirst for revenge was starting to become a fire in my gut and consume me. Somehow, Rebecca, Joshua, and Ronald had to pay for what they had done. Why, Ronald? Come on. Do you think the woman and her old lover would stoop to destroying me? I figure Ronald was pulling the strings and was orchestrating the whole thing. Otherwise, I would have been served 3 weeks ago, and I would have gotten a local attorney. The judge would have been fair in their judgment. No, Ronald was behind the whole thing. He had never really wanted me to be his son-in-law. And now, with his daughter's permission, he was going to make me pay. Late in the afternoon, Rebecca and Joshua arrived at the office to take over. They showed Stacy, the secretary, the signed court documents that indicated the transfer of ownership to a new corporation, and that I was now the manager rather than the owner-manager. Thankfully, they didn't publicly humiliate me by announcing my new salary. Aside from Stacy, who needed the information to issue paychecks, no one else knew they were earning more weekly than I was. I knew Stacy would inform everyone, but for the moment, the business was to continue as usual. When the troublesome pair arrived, I excused myself, saying a client needed me at his office, and left. I wasn't about to risk jail for violating the protection order, which would also serve their purposes. At least the protection order only forbade me from coming within 100 feet of any of them, any larger range in our small town. And I might as well bunk under a bridge outside of town. After work, I stopped at one of the local bars. The owner was one of my clients. I had computerized his point-of-sale system so that even his taps were integrated and could give him reports and automatically order alcohol as needed. He met me at the bar. "I am sorry, Ted, but I can't serve you. The word is out. Anyone who serves you, sells you something, or even talks in a friendly way will have their loans accelerated, and no one can handle that. You will have to leave." He gave me a wink and nodded toward the back door. I knew where the gaps were in his security camera system, so I nodded and left. I hugged the wall, slid around to the back, and met him outside the back door. He had a 12-pack of my favorite beer under his arm. "Ted, I am sorry. Take this as a peace offering. Hopefully Maines will get over his bad mood and stop this nonsense." That was all he said before slipping back inside. I hugged the wall again and walked back to my lonely little apartment. When I got there, I found a used but still serviceable mattress box springs and Hollywood frame, leaning against the back door. Whoopee! I didn't have to sleep on that air again. After putting the beer on ice, I wrestled the bed up to my apartment and got it set up. It was a better night's sleep, aided by 5 or 6 beers in a mostly comfortable bed. The next day I went to Ned's for groceries. I reached the checkout lane and was then escorted to the door without my items. Ned himself came out to expel me. Ted, I appreciate you and your family, but I can't defy Ronald. Means he would close me down in a week if he knew I was even speaking to you as I escorted you out. I'm sorry. Give my regards to your mother. He contorted his face as if he were angry with me, presumably for any onlookers and the security camera, and pushed me gently at the door. That evening, all the groceries I had selected were in a wooden box with a padlock next to my back door. The key was on the driver's side front tire. I emptied the box and left it outside. I attempted to move it, and it was extremely heavy. Upon examining the bottom, I found steel plates attached to it. I guess my unknown benefactor didn't want someone tampering with the box. True, it wouldn't deter someone determined to mess with me, but at least the average person wouldn't interfere. I went out of town for a couple of days to serve as a few other clients. A germ of an idea was starting to grow. I couldn't get what I wanted locally, so I stopped at a small out-of-town service station and purchased some small fuel cans. I bought regular gasoline and some diesel fuel each trip out of town. I purchased a couple of items that I needed to complete my plan. During this time, Rebecca and Joshua attempted to make my life difficult. I had to change my phone number because she would call me repeatedly throughout the day. Then an officer would visit to hassle me about violating the protection order. I would demonstrate that I never responded so I could not be in violation. The officer would tell me to stop messing around and then leave. It got so I couldn't even fuel my car. A company car, mind you. I would have to send someone else to fuel up just so I could get my work done. My plan was fully realized when Maine's Federal Bank began to bother my mother. She received numerous calls daily, urging her to come in and consider a reverse mortgage. The county alleged they hadn't received her tax payment. Upon contacting the tax assessor, he quietly mentioned on the phone that Ronald Maines was pressuring him to mess with my mother. Now the scoundrel had to pay. He couldn't threaten Mom about a mortgage, but was troubling her in other ways. She didn't need the stress. A week was all I needed to get ready. It had to be in the middle of the night when there were only a couple of officers on duty and usually doozing in their cruisers. I could prepare. Then I would sneak away and drive to another town during the day to catch a nap in my car. I also purchased an old rattle-trap pickup from a farmer about 40 miles away. I didn't immediately title it as the plates were still good for a few more months. He brought it to an old abandoned house about a mile out of town and stashed it behind the house for me. I initiated the plan just after every business in town had closed for the night. I checked to ensure they were all dark before beginning. I intended for no one to get injured, but I was indifferent to the possibility of certain individuals sustaining harm. Time to act. First, I went into the office and remotely turned off the fire alarm systems in each business I was going to hit. These systems were integrated into their networks, and all of them had used my business to set up the systems. I didn't mess with the hospital or even the bank, as there might be federal laws broken if their systems were deliberately messed with. I visited the convenience store on the town's outskirts. A brick served to shatter the door's glass. I combined diesel and gasoline in a bottle to create an incendiary device. I ignited the fuel-drenched wick and hurled it through the door, striking the shelf to shatter the bottle. I then drove across town and repeated my action at the other store. I could hear the sirens as the volunteer fire department responded to the first fire. I smiled to myself. Ronald had forced his way into being elected the volunteer fire chief and was also on the board of trustees for the fire department. He had always resisted spending money on any improvements. Tonight was going to show the error of his ways. I visited the farm supply store. The manager was unpleasant even when I wasn't being harassed. I strategically placed 3 incendiary devices in different parts of the building to ensure the fire spread. The fire alarm and suppression systems were connected, so the sprinklers activated, but no alarm sounded. I ensured the fire was too extensive for the sprinklers to handle before they activated. Lacking additional water from the fire department, the sprinkler system was quickly overpowered when most of the commercial district was ablaze. I called my old home using a disposable phone. Rebecca picked up, and through the electronic voice changer I'd purchased from a toy store. I kept the message brief in a voice reminiscent of Darth Vader. I warned her of an arsonist and advised her to take her children to Ted, Mayor Ron's mother's house for safety. I sat on the street and watched as about an hour later, Rebecca left with the children and headed for her parents' large house. I expected this, but she was in for a surprise. I wasn't in a rush, but ensured my old house was ablaze before I walked a few blocks to my car. When she pulled into her parents' gated community. Yes, our little town actually had a gated community, complete with security patrols. She found their house on fire with her mother standing outside, wringing her hands. Guess who handled the computer system for the gated community and their security company? The patrol was off dealing with a break-in alarm when the fire started. I later learned that Rebecca stayed with her mother for some time before they all got back into Rebecca's car and drove to my mother's house, as even the motels were having trouble with their computer systems and couldn't check anyone in. My final task was to leave the company car at the office. I opened the door, threw in my last Molotov cocktail, and set the car ablaze. Unbeknownst to Rebecca, Joshua, and her unpleasant father, I had canceled the insurance on the building and the vehicles. I then walked to the first fire where the fire department was determinedly trying to prevent it from spreading. Ronald was standing next to the single fire engine, wearing his expensive white fire gear and matching white helmet, directing the somewhat inebriated members. Since the police were scattered throughout town checking for anyone inside the other fires, there was no one to hinder my progress. There was no other fire department coming to help because Ronald had refused to sign mutual aid agreements and had alienated other departments. Tough luck for him now. I approached Ronald from behind and activated the voice changer once more. This time, I pressed a small dowel against his back. In Darth Vader's voice, I warned, "Don't turn or jerk, or you might get hurt very badly." Ronald froze and began to speak. "Be quiet, jerk, and listen. Your town is on fire. If you don't want it to happen again, you had better change your behavior. No one is immune to consequences. Even your own house is now ablaze. Pay attention and make a change. Stop being obnoxious or face more consequences." I didn't want him to turn, so I shoved him, and he landed in a mud hole. Quite the look, his pure white gear now muddy. He started to come up to his knees, and I shoved him with my foot, and he got a face full of muddy water. I turned and strolled off, disappearing into the crowd, watching the futile efforts to douse the flames. I made my way to the hidden pickup and headed out of the area. A long way out of the area. I assumed I was going to be under suspicion. Even a corrupt department sometimes has to investigate crimes. And this was a whopper. I landed in a large metropolitan area, 3 states away from my hometown. I didn't try to hide or change my name or find a false identity. Really, I didn't care. I was prevented from seeing my children. They had been adopted by Joshua. I had no money to send for child support or alimony. I knew the cops would be coming for me, so I didn't try to start a new business. I just applied for an IT job and was soon doing the same work as I had done before. I waited a while before calling Mom on a burner phone. I was so paranoid. I actually drove 50 miles away from my apartment in case law enforcement would try to trace my phone. I guess I didn't need to be so paranoid. Mom was happy to hear from me. She was excited to share the local news first. "I'm relieved you're alive. At first, we thought you might have been in the apartment when the building burned, but there was no evidence of a body. Someone eventually suggested that you had been very unhappy and had likely left your resignation letter for Becky and Josh before leaving town. But the letter would have been destroyed in the fire. Thank you for letting me know within a day or so that you were alive." Second, Becky and Josh didn't get married. It seems he was already married in another state and hadn't gotten divorced yet. Becky and the kids stayed with me until she could find a new house. It is actually smaller than the one you guys used to live in. Third, most of the businesses and homes that were burned were insured by the insurance agency that the bank provided. They suffered significant losses from the claims, which led to the withdrawal of their franchise. When insurance investigators examined the cause of the substantial losses, they were displeased to discover that Ronald Maines, the fire chief responsible for pre-planning for potential fires, was at the helm. The insurance company is suing Ronald for preventing the fire department from adopting contemporary firefighting techniques and for not establishing necessary mutual aid agreements. Fourth, a new bank has opened an office here, and a lot of the businesses that burned got loans from the new bank, and that has cut into Maine's federal bank earnings. I didn't know it, but there was a board of directors at Maine's Federal, and they are not happy with how Ronald is running things. He is on a short leash right now. Fifth, since Becky decided not to marry Josh, she withdrew the protection order and is open to communication. Additionally, the children are still legally yours. Becky requested the judge amend the divorce proceedings as they had not reached the 90-day finalization period. It's possible that your marriage is still valid. The children inquire about you daily when they arrive here after school. Sixth, did you know that Judge Gavin had a car collection? I guess he kept it under his hat, but it burned down that night. He looks ancient now. The rumor is that Ronald had basic liability insurance on the cars to keep the judge's expenses down. He only got a couple of $100 for each car he owned. The gossip chain insists he lost over $1 million, and he doesn't much like Ronald Maines any longer. We are looking for a new police chief. The sheriff has decided to not run again. Some of the deputies and cops have resigned. Becky's parents are searching for a new place to live. Their house was completely destroyed, and they can't find a suitable apartment to stay in while their new house is under construction. It might take a couple of years to finish the house. That is, if they can even find a builder willing to take on the job. Becky even asked if I was willing to sell or rent them my house. I thought about it briefly, but then declined, citing their past mistreatment of my son as the reason I couldn't trust them with my property. Ronald was upset, but since he's facing legal issues, even the tax assessor dismissed his complaints. Incidentally, they found my tax payment. It seems the assessor got a clear message that night when his cars and RV were set on fire. Now, with Ronald's influence diminishing, many people seem much happier. Their tax problems also vanished overnight. Right now, it seems the only ones disturbed by the fires were the business owners and Ronald Maines. Everyone else is of the opinion that fire sometimes cleanses. So when are you coming to visit your old mom and your kids? I had to chuckle. I guess I need to plan a trip home very soon. I might have to arrange for a better vehicle, though. My old ride barely made it here. I will see you very soon, Mom. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care.